Well, welcome to another edition of the Walker County History Hour. Of course, everyone knows me, John Culpepper, and that's all I'll say. You know me, good or bad. But sitting to my right is Donnie Haney. Now, the reason Donnie's accompanying me, we're doing a documentary on Crystal Springs Print Works. As most folks know, it's been torn down. It was shut down a couple of years ago, and Donnie is the last employee of Crystal Springs Print Works. And Donnie, you went to work there in 1970. 1970. So Donnie has seen the good times, he's seen the bad times. So generally we're going to talk about the mill. And we broke this up into two segments. We're going to talk about the history of the mill. And then our second segment, we're actually going down to the grounds. And Donnie's going to lead you through the different components of the mill. Now, there were two operations there. There was a cloth manufacturing part, which we call a cotton mill, or back then they really called it the gray mill, right?
Right.
Gray goods.
Gray goods.
And the second component was the bleachery, and that's where they finished cloth. Now, they didn't finish the cloth that they manufactured there at the cotton mill. Basically, it was used for liners in your pockets of your pants. I know in the later stages, and I've been over there, you had cloth coming in from all over the world that you were finishing.
Yes.
I mean, I remember one day when I was over there, you had some from Russia.
Russia, Hong Kong, Pakistan, even I believe at one time we had some from Egypt.
And one of your largest customers back during the Iraqi war was the military. Y'all basically printed the camouflage that the uniforms of men wore in that conflict. Is that correct?
That's right. We did also did the Navy, the Air Force, Marines.
And I was over there one day just printing some camouflage for the Denmark Army, I believe it was.
I believe we did. We also did some for the Mexican Army.
So it was a vital wartime industry, just like they were in World War II. Now, I'm going to read about the history of that facility because I met with Boeing Jewel, and she gave me a lot of written material, and I don't want to leave anything out. I can't memorize all of it, but it's a unique story, and it's a typical small southern textile town that was really the main industry across the South for years and years and years and years and years. And of course now we know it's all moved overseas. You can't buy a shirt or a pair of pants that's made in the United States of America anymore. And some of the machines that my dad worked on, he was in the card room, probably still in use in Taiwan or Vietnam or somewhere today. And first of all, I'm going to read some history of Jewel, Georgia, which ties in with Daniel Ashley Jewel, who was born in Massachusetts. And about age 25, he relocated to Milledgeville, Georgia, the state capital, and married there in 1849 Mary Ann Shea. In the mid-1850s, he operated D.A. Jewel and Company, a wool manufacturing firm, and this was his occupation just prior to the purchase of the rock factory, which he also purchased. And he moved to Jewel, then called Rock Factory, by 1859, for he was living there in 1860. Now you understand that prior to the American Civil War, or I like to say war between the states, the textile industry was located in the Northeast, Massachusetts, New England, and so Mr. Jewel had moved down to Georgia and brought his knowledge of the textile industry, and so he started a mill operation in what is now known Jewel, Georgia. It was known as Rock Factory at that time. During the war between the states, while the town was still known as Rock Factory, a company known as the Ogeechee Minutemen was formed in 1863 with Jewel himself, the Northerner, as the state's adjutant general for weapons. Tradition has it that Federal soldiers came through the town in 1864 after reaching the shoals on the Ogeechee a few miles to the south, but did not burn the mills or the town due to seeing a Masonic symbol on the mill's chimney. This stone was later salvaged and is now located at Callaway Gardens, Pine Mountain, Georgia. Now, the Jewels and the Callaway were kin to each other by marriage, because when I went to high school, Mr. Callaway, Shad Callaway, was the chairman of the city school system board and gave me my diploma. So there's a connection there with Callaway Gardens. A Baptist church was organized there in 1869, and the brick edifice was built in 1871 on the green, also sponsored by Mr. Jewel. It is the oldest brick church building in the Washington Baptist Association. The wooden Methodist church was built about 1841-1845 at Rock Mill and was moved to Jewel in 1894. It had been previously known as Rock Mills Church. Today it stands on the northwest side of town. The name of the town remained Rock Factory until approximately 1869-1870. An act of the legislature in 1872 incorporated the town as Jules Mill, and maps after this day are the first to show this new name. Later the name became Jules and later Jewel, as it remains today. The U.S. Post Office at Jules was established in 1873 with Mr. Jewel as the postmaster, later to be succeeded by his son. D.A. Jewel died in 1896 and was buried in a town that not only bore his name, but bore the results of his hard work and benevolence. His wife, who died the year before, is buried there also. D.A. Jewel Sr.'s sole ownership of the mill continued until 1875, when his son-in-law, Colonel W.L. Boeing, acquired a partnership with him, and the name was changed to the Boeing Jewel Company. Now this goes back to the old mill system of being paid with company scrip. Metal coins were minted for use by the mill workers during this period. Eventually, D.A. Jewel Jr., 1860 to 1835, became the family partner with Colonel Boyd. Now, metal coins were minted for the mill workers. In other words, they had a company store. And so you got paid off in company money, and you had to go to the company store and buy your goods. So, and you lived in a company house that was owned by the mill company also. And of course, they had their own carpenter crews that kept up the houses, but when you got paid once a week, or back then you got paid once a week, they'd take your rent, your electricity, and your water out of your paycheck, because just like Chickamauga was back in the heydays, back in the 20s and 30s, the mill generated the electricity for all the mill houses and generated all the water for the mill houses. Plus, it also treated water for downtown Chickamauga and a few residents in the area close to the mill. So they were the first water system in Chickamauga. Now, the city of Chickamauga went into a standalone water system in 1946 and disconnected from the mill. Eventually, D.A. Jewel Jr., 1860-1835, became the family partner with Colonel Boyd. Sales were made in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and Jewel Jr. built a plant there, alternating weeks supervising the plants at Jewel and Chattanooga. Now, the Boeing Jewel Company made sacks for use at grist mills and flour mills and corn mill factories, and most of their business was in East Tennessee. And first plant they built in Chickamauga was the Boeing Jewel Bag Company, and everyone remembers A.S. Boeing, Albert Sidney Boeing, who was a nephew that was brought on board to be a salesman to call on their customers in East Tennessee. Now, I like to tell this little story. I know Mr. Boeing, knew him. I learned a lot of history from him. But AS stood for Albert Sidney Boeing, who was named after Albert Sidney Johnson, the Confederate general that got killed at Shiloh. But all the mill workers used to refer to Mr. Boeing as ASS Boeing. If you get what I'm saying. They undoubtedly didn't have a lot of respect for Mr. Boeing. Okay. Now let's talk about, they acquired the property for this new enterprise from Congressman Gordon Lee. Now, as we know, prior to the war between the states, modern Chickamauga was a 500-acre plantation. And after the war, it became a farm. And then in 1891, a group of men got together with Congressman Gordon Lee, the grandson of James Gordon, who bought the property from the Cherokee Land Lottery, and developed modern-day Chickamauga. And they had good intentions of it being a tourist town, built that nice grand hotel, the Park Hotel, because if you were going to Chickamauga Battlefield, you would come to Chickamauga by train, and that's how come we got that nice rock depot down there, because it was for tourists. The train came through that area in 1888, and then you take a buggy, horse and buggy to the battlefield. So, Mr. Jewel, and there's a little story about how they bought this property from Congressman Gordon Lee. And I'll go into that right now. D.A. Jewel and his business partner, Colonel Boeing, bought land in Chickamauga in 1907 from U.S. Senator Gordon Lee. The men had heard that Gordon Lee, the owner of the Springs, was proud of his sharp business dealings and had sold Crystal Springs several times, only to repossess it as soon as the first payment was missed. Jewel and Boeing dressed themselves in their worst clothes and tried to look like a less than affluent rural man. They approached Lee and discussed buying the land. When a price had been quoted, they told Lee to have his attorney to draw up the papers. They were returned to work out the terms of the purchase. When they came back, they were wearing their normal clothes and had their attorneys with them. Rather than seeking terms, they paid in cash, and Lee had no choice but to give up the property. So they tricked Congressman Gordon Lee into selling the property. He had sort of ran a scam on people and selling that property. This concludes the history of the beginning of the Crystal Springs Bleachery, Crystal Springs Flint Works, the early history of Mr. Jewel and how he ended up from Massachusetts and his family ended up in Chickamauga, Georgia. And now we're going to proceed to the timeline from the beginning of the operation to the end of the operation, which is happening today.